what gets people so riled up about it. So some of you, many of you, are familiar with the book already. For those of you who aren't, a brief synopsis. The general layout of the book, and it is very fast-paced, is a nice way of saying doesn't cover everything. But I do try to give the most basic kind of information about the Bible up front. What is it? Since people mean by that word different things, depending on whom you ask. The Bible means something different. And a little bit about the context out of which the biblical text comes, so a little bit of history that relates to the development of the biblical texts as they were written and also as they were collected, which were a couple of different projects, as well as a chapter titled What's the Best Translation, getting after that question of translation and how that affects our reading of biblical texts. And in that, I include a bit on the King James Version. This is the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Version. So there's all this stuff coming out about the King James. And I just actually posted a little thing for Huffington Post on the King James Version that starts with this anecdote that real, true life experience. Riding the DC Metro, a young woman got on, sat next to me, and she said, are you visiting? I said, I am visiting. And after we got through like 2 sentences of pleasantries, she said, did you know that when King James wrote the Bible, he didn't put it all in? where do I start with this? At any rate, we had an interesting conversation, as you can imagine, if that was its starting point. But there are so many things that we know about the Bible kind of by the fact that it's in our ether, in the atmosphere, but so many things we don't know, and things that folks may think they know actually may be, in this case, quite misleading. So I'd hoped with this book to do some to alleviate those misunderstandings and give people a little bit more confidence when they're when they're thinking about this text, when you're reading it for themselves, or simply the way that it shows up in contemporary culture. So then a couple of other chapters deal with famous texts, the things that crop up as quotes, like Psalm 23, for instance, which is a very famous and beloved psalm by people for whom the Bible is their sacred text, that begins, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. It's very King Jamesian, and showed up in the movie True Grit with this really interesting change. So the main character, Maddie, this 14-year-old who's on this vengeance quest, right, justice for her father's murder, says to herself, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no one, which was a really interesting twist on evil. We had this conversation at the Virginia Book Festival with this panel of folks who had written religion books about evil. Where does evil come from? And is it human or is it supernatural? So anyway, I loved the way True Grit kind of got after that question by changing that line just a wee bit. So it's fun to know a little bit more about some of these famous quotes in order to do some of that kind of critical work when you hear it in a popular movie. And then I also spend some chapters on famous characters, famous men, famous women, famous things like Leviathan or the talking snake in Genesis, and a chapter dealing with controversial issues in which people use the Bible to argue sometimes both sides of the same matter. Homosexuality, yay, nay. Abortion, yay, nay. You see people using the Bible to support their arguments, and so in that chapter I wanted just to show what the texts are that people use or how they read in order to arrive at the conclusions that they do. And then finally a chapter on God, all the different names for God, and the images of God in the Bible. So just a little bit of sampling from the chapter on